So how long are you going to be traveling around?
4 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did the first month here, and now we're gonna keep going.
Gonna make a circuit. Do you, after Colombia, into Central America, or?
Not Central, not this trip. We're
Yeah.
thinking Peru,
Oh yeah.
Argentina, probably.
Oh yeah. So go up that way a little bit, and
Yeah.
then really to the south. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Both of those countries are wonderful and have so much to offer. Yeah, it'll be great fun.
Cool. Yeah, I'm super excited. Is this on? Okay. All right. So could you please introduce yourself?
I'm Kelly Swing. I'm the founding director of the Tiputini Biodiversity Station.
And what is the Tiputini Biodiversity Station?
The Tiputini Biodiversity Station is a multifaceted facility associated with the Universidad de San Francisco de Quito and with lots of support from Boston University. The station has a few different kinds of focal activities. One of those is research, another is education, and another is conservation. And the idea is basically to learn as much as we can so that we can have arguments to pass along to students and to other people so that people care about it, and then eventually we can save it. So basically study, share, and save are those three focal areas.
And what do you mean by save it?
Yeah, save it, somehow protect it so that 10 years from now or 100 years from now, Yosemite can still be the wonderful place that it is today in a natural sense. It's a gigantic challenge because, like every other part of the world, people are moving in and people are extracting everything from oil to gold to timber, and they're opening up areas to put in pastures and croplands and those kind of things. So, yeah, there's a lot to save it from.
Can you talk about where it's at and how biodiverse it is?
Yeah, so the Biodiversity Station is on the northern border of the Yosemite National Park. It's in eastern Ecuador at about 200 meters elevation. And so it's very close to the equator, and it's very close to the foothills of the Andes. And those two factors come together to provide a situation that it has been very conducive to the development and maintenance of species diversity. And so we call our area in eastern Ecuador the world's most species diverse place. We're not absolutely certain that that's the case because we haven't documented the species diversity of the planet in any country yet. Even the smallest of countries, even in northern temperate kinds of areas, don't have complete lists of species. We're still cataloging species, but what we do know leads us to believe that eastern Ecuador is the most species diverse place, and it makes sense because of being on the equator and in this transition zone between lowland Amazonia and the Andes.
And can you give some of the statistics about plants, bugs, bats?
Sure. So whenever we talk about mega diverse places, I think we should probably have another category for Ecuador and maybe call it hyper diverse, something that extends a little beyond a few dozen countries in the world that we categorize as mega diverse. If we talk about the whole country, it's really amazing. I realize that words like that are pretty mundane at this point, but we have to use some of those superlatives and hope that they still mean something to somebody. For example, Ecuador has twice as many bird species as the U.S. and Canada combined. Ecuador is about the size of the state of Colorado. If we just look at the Yosemite National Park or the Tiputini Biodiversity Station, we can provide some numbers and give some context as well. For example, trees are relatively easy to catalog. They're large and they don't move around. So scientists can go in and get a relatively good census of what's present. And so for trees, the total for eastern Ecuador is over 2,000 species. If we just look at small patches of the forest, as you know, and when I say patches, I don't mean separate areas, but I mean small pieces of the rainforest in eastern Ecuador. If we count all the woody plants that are rooted in the ground and are at least as thick as your finger, the trunk, then we have an average of right around 600 species per hectare. A hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters, so similar to the floor of a football stadium, including sidelines and everything. So in a space that small, we have 600 species of trees or treelets, right? In the U.S. and Canada combined, there's about 560 species of trees. So once again, we have this situation: 1 hectare versus 1 continent, right? More species in a city block worth of space than in the U.S. and Canada combined. So those are the easy plants to deal with. The other smaller things are more diverse and more difficult to sort out as far as the total number of species, and so we're still working on the catalog there. And whenever we talk about species diversity, we have to basically recognize that we have not made a complete list of those species, and so we're still in that process, in the process of going from finding a new species to applying a scientific name to it. May require anything from as short as a few months up to decades, and it all has to do with just how complex a certain group of organisms might be. Anyway, if we go over to the animals to talk about species diversity, we'll start with the invertebrates, insects basically in the forest. For insects, the best estimates are 100,000 species per hectare. And when I say 100,000 species, lots of people immediately respond by saying, you mean individuals, right? You don't mean species. No, I mean species. If we talk about individuals, we're talking about several billion individual insects per hectare. But 100,000 species per hectare. There's about 100,000 species total for all of the U.S. and Canada combined. So very different scale of diversity. And another thing about the diversity that we're trying to document in Yosemite is that if you go from one of those hectares to the next one and to the next one and to the next one, what you notice is that they're not all the same. Despite the fact that if you fly over a rainforest, and some people have described it as looking like broccoli, the texture, it's kind of like that. But the truth is that it's not all the same. And with all that diversity of plants there, you basically have different kinds of things to eat for different kinds of insects. And so the diversity kind of stacks on top and it just multiplies at each layer. So with the insects, a good portion of the big things are pretty well known. The difficult part about insects is that a huge proportion are tiny. And according to the entomologists that work in the New World tropics, they usually say that the average size of insects is somewhere on the order of 2 to 3 millimeters. Well, I think every human that walks through the forest, we tend to look for the big things. And of course, most people don't even notice the big insects. They're looking for things like monkeys and jaguars and sloths and tapirs and peccaries, that kind of stuff. So we notice something when it's as big as your hand and it's electric blue, something like morpho butterflies, and they're very common. but we don't notice the small things. So the big things are pretty well cataloged, but according to the best collections that have been made in places like Yosemite, more than 80% of the insects don't have scientific names yet. And like I said, the big easy things that were described, in the last century, especially in the last half century, but now the real chore is to sort out all the tiny things. And so we can say, you got this tray full of insects and some of them are small, so we can get an idea of what the total number might be, but we can't turn in an official list of the species yet. If we go from there toward the vertebrates, we can mention the freshwater fishes, just to have some perspective. In Amazonia, we're estimating somewhere around 3,000 species of fish. In the whole world, freshwater and saltwater, there's only about 30,000 species of fish. So a tenth of them just in the Amazon basin. If we look at eastern Ecuador, certainly over 400 species of fish. If you look at freshwater fish in North America, the total, once again for the U.S. and Canada combined, is about 800. So eastern Ecuador is smaller than South Carolina, right? And so, but it's got half as many freshwater fish as all of those two big countries, right? And once again, a lot of species are not well known and still don't have scientific names. If we step out of the water and onto the land, and well, for the most part, for amphibians, best estimate for the Yosemite National Park is over 150 species. And of course, some of those are tiny, plain brown things that most ecotourists wouldn't really care about. Some of them are just amazingly brilliant things like dart poison frogs that are so colorful that you have to ask, how could they possibly survive out there without something just coming along and eating them? And it's because they're extremely toxic, and so all the predators know who they are and they leave them alone. But 150 species of frogs, for some context there, the U.S. and Canada together have about 95 species. So this tiny area versus a huge area, temperate zone versus right on the equator. So for reptiles, a little over 120 species. So there, we're talking about snakes and turtles and lizards and caimans. And then if we talk about, we already mentioned the birds briefly. And so, but among the birds, they have lots of emblematic things that are associated with tropical rainforests, things like toucans and macaws, that probably everybody that visits a rainforest just want to see them. They're spectacular kinds of organisms, certainly. Then for mammals, there's about 200 species just in the Yosemite National Park. And among those 200 species, there's 10 species of monkeys. There's 2 species of deer. There are 2 species of peccaries, 5 species of cats, which is pretty impressive. So, the biggest species there, jaguars, and then pumas, and then ocelots, margay cats are quite small, and then jaguarundis. So those 5 species, 4 of those species are patterned cats that basically look like different size versions of jaguars. And then the jaguarundis are essentially just very dark colored, smaller cats. And then among the mammals, there's 30 or 40 species of rodents that range from absolutely tiny up to over 100 pounds in the case of the capybara. And so that's still, we're not even approaching 100 species yet. And then there's some other small groups of things like opossums, several species, once again, that range from the size of the typical possum that can be seen in North America, down to some species that are called mouse opossums that really are, head to butt about that size. But once again, we're still there summing our total. We're not approaching, certainly not approaching 200 species that I mentioned. But the big group that fills in a huge gap in the summing there is the bats. There's 100 species of bats in Yosemite, and maybe a few more. Some bats are very secretive and very rare, and they fly very high, and so documenting their presence is going to take a while. But if we need a little context for that kind of diversity, most states in the U.S. have fewer than 10 species of bats. And certainly as you go farther to the north, some states only have 2 or 3 species of bats. But to have 100 species of anything in one place is ecologically difficult to understand, because we think of organisms that fall into a category, this broad category like bats, as being quite similar. And so how do they all fit in, and how can they all have food in a place to live and to carry out their activities? And how does that work? And that's one of those big questions about the tropics in general. How do all these things fit into one place? But as it turns out, there's different kinds of specializations. So bats, some of them visit flowers and drink nectar, and some of them eat fruits, and some of them eat fruits down inside the forest, and some of them eat fruits at the top of the canopy, and some of them eat insects, and some of them grab fish out of the water, and some of them even specialize on consuming blood. And there's some that only eat blood from mammals, and there's some that only eat blood from birds. And so it's one of those situations where the level of specialization fits the tremendous level of biodiversity. So I think another thing that's surprising is that if you see a tremendous amount of diversity in one group of organisms, many people might expect that somehow the other groups are going to be far less to somehow compensate because these guys are being so successful, then it doesn't leave much room for everybody else. But in the tropics, typically you have, if one group of organisms is diverse, then it looks like everybody else is too, which is kind of complicates the explanation of how they all fit together even further, right?
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, sorry about that really long answer.
No, that's okay.
It's great for cutting out most of it.
It's interesting. We'll definitely use some of it. Could you scoot your chair back just a tiny bit in the same spot, though? Yeah.
Like that?
Yeah. Perfect. And try to sit up straight.
Okay. Sorry, Mom.
Okay. You could put your hands on the desk. Just.
Yeah. Just don't lean out so much. Don't slouch so much. Sit up properly.
It's funny because on some of the interviews that I did before, I was like too shy to tell them what doesn't look good in interviews, which is usually like the crossed arms. You're and then afterwards, I was like, oh, I should have said something. Yeah. So now I'm like practicing that.
Crossing arms definitely looks like somebody's hiding or they're insecure tense about something. Yeah.
Diego was talking to us. He gave a whole presentation about how oil in Ecuador is threatening this region of the forest. Mm-hmm. Could you... I didn't really get much of this in his interview that I did with him, so could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Well, that's a pretty broad question.
Yeah, okay.
No, it's okay. We can, if you don't mind me rambling around a bit.
Yeah, you can ramble.
Yeah, okay.
Just to give someone who has no idea about what's happening right now a little bit of context.
Okay.
And he said that also Ecuador has had the most oil spills than any other country.
Yeah, I don't know if we can actually document that. Ecuador's had a lot of oil spills, and Ecuador has oil spills probably almost every week. Of course, most of them are pretty small, and most of them happen in relatively remote places, and so we never hear about them. But certainly, if you added up all the oil spills that have occurred in eastern Ecuador, there would be more than the Exxon Valdez. No, without a question. I've seen some estimates of how many oil spills happen in eastern Ecuador, and it works out to 100 a year. Uh, but this is something too that is absolutely ironic. Is that what gets reported as a spill and what gets just glossed over? For example, as a personal experience, this has been a few years ago. I was contracted to evaluate an oil spill and to say something about its extent and how much how great the impact was and those kind of things. And so I went out to this place, which turns out to be right in the middle of the Yasuni National Park. And there's just the landscape is black, basically as far as you can see. And we spent some time there trying to sort out, okay, how many things are dying and how many things are affected, how many species are affected, those kind of things. And there was a cleanup crew there that ended up staying in that place, recovering oil for months, and actually at the end of that process, going out and scraping away a layer of soil about 15 centimeters deep, so like 6 inches deep, and they hauled that away to be bioremediated somewhere, to recover it. But they were there doing that kind of thing for a year, right? The area that was impacted was only about a square kilometer, but it was impacted completely. So it's basically, okay, we try to rein in the oil that got out there, put it back in barrels, and then to actually clean up the area, literally going in with bulldozers and scraping away the surface, cutting down the forest, scraping away. And this was in a swampy kind of place, and so it was a mess. It was a huge mess. And so there was a tremendous effort involved in recovering the oil and recovering the site. And most years, at the end of the year, because of where I work, I'm invited to corporate presentations of their year, of their last year. Right? So they talk about annual budgets and what they've accomplished and what they've done for local people and all those kind of things. And in the formal report that was published that year, it's actually like a magazine kind of publication. They had some paragraphs about how proud they were that no oil spills had occurred. And I was thinking, I was out there and walking around in this stuff, and it seemed like an oil spill, and unless I was dreaming, and unless you guys didn't really contract me, unless I really don't have photos of that whole process, something happened that appeared to me to be an oil spill. And what was the explanation? It was like, well, to actually be categorized as an oil spill, it has to exceed something like 10,000 barrels. And so, well, it didn't exceed 10,000 barrels, but it impacted a big piece of forest, and it was real. But somehow between the event and the bookkeeping, it just disappeared because it didn't reach some minimum threshold, which I think is something that we all need to be aware of right around the world. Okay, let me just answer that, and we'll continue with this story. I got a little distracted by that. Hello? Hello?
Does it look good?
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Okay. Ya, bueno, está muy bien. Estoy en una entrevista y al terminar esto podemos hacer algo con ella, ¿sí? Ya, por si acaso mi puerta está cerrada y entonces si alguien puede esperar ahí afuera un momento y ya. Ok, bueno, ya, gracias. So, you want to continue the oil story a bit?
Yeah.
Isn't that situation just ridiculous?
That's crazy. I didn't know that.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like everything. It's like, well, if I cut my arm, I can just put a Band-Aid on it. If I get cut and have to go to the hospital, then it reaches a different category, right?
Yeah. That's crazy. I had no idea.
Anyway, obviously I should go in a different direction with the oil stuff. That might have been a little too specific and too much storytelling there.
Well, no, I think it's important to know that for sure. Okay.
So how's your Spanish?
Good.
Yours is good.
I lived in Barcelona for 2 years,
Oh,
so
wow.
I got to practice
So
and
do
learn
you
it.
have an accent from Spain?
No, because my friends are Peruvians. So the people I was talking to, I kind of took their accent.
They didn't let you develop that pretentious continental accent.
It sounds kind of funny when Americans or like people from the United States have that accent too.
And it sounds, and I think most Latin Americans think it's just silly sounding.
Yeah, it's silly and it is kind of pretentious.
Yeah. And of course, most reasonable Spaniards would say that we're about the most pretentious people on the planet. So fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, back to the oil, right? So when we talk about oil in Yosemite, there's a few things that we should recognize. With some international press in the last few years, especially associated with the Yosemite ITT initiative, it appears that this message started floating around that we're just now beginning to extract oil from Yosemite. The truth is that we found oil in Yosemite in the 1930s, and we were extracting oil in the western parts of Yosemite by the 1970s. And so we've been doing this for most of a half a century, and I think most people would guess, we've come to a point where there are oil wells scattered across a big portion of this reserve. And despite the fact that it's a protected area, according to the laws of Ecuador, we are carrying out these industrial operations, even in relatively remote places. But the easiest parts of Yosemite to access were the parts that are closest to civilization and where there are already roads and that. So we started in the west, and as time has gone on, we've opened up one more concession area and used those basically as stepping stones, and we've gone from the west and the north right out into the central part of the park. So that the only oil concession areas that haven't been exploited on a big scale, or it would be the blocks that are in the very most eastern extreme and in the very southern extremes. And so in the last year or so, we've really started to push into that eastern part. So the blocks in this country are given number designations, and as it turns out, the Tiputini Biodiversity Station has been engulfed by Block 14. It doesn't mean that we have an oil well in our camp, but every year there's this potential for an oil well to be installed a little bit closer to us. But anyway, a little bit farther to the east in Block 31, there's a big push, and there's the opening of a new road. And so the scenario is changing for Yosemite, because when we open roads to get access to oil, we also allow access to hunters and timber harvesters. And so there's this essentially a domino effect, or a chain reaction that sets off a tremendous wave of impact. Opening an oil road really could be this narrow little scar across the landscape, but it almost never stays that way. It's a scar that somebody's going to pick at, right? And so it just expands and expands, and pretty soon you have an oil road, and then you have pastures, and you have crops, and then you have things like an African palm plantation. In eastern Ecuador, there's over 20,000 hectares of African palm plantations now, which 20,000 hectares is a big piece of land. And as the world consumes more and more palm oil, people continue to plant more and more of it. The oil operations in eastern Ecuador, especially the ones that were carried out in the 1970s and 1980s, did not follow procedures that we now consider to be minimal as far as the environment is concerned. So there's tremendous ecological footprint in eastern Ecuador from those operations. As time has gone on, more international kinds of oversight has occurred, and so more modern operations have become better at managing the relationship with the environment and with maintaining forest. But they all have access roads, and so it means that there's the first wave of impact, which is provoked by the oil operations themselves, and then there's the second wave that's provoked by the arrival of squatters, basically, who build homes, clear forest, sell timber, establish farms, and raise cattle and all those things. And so once you have that, the road access that's can only be developed really with heavy machinery, then it turns a bit into a free-for-all. And that has been the history of eastern Ecuador for, like I said, most of a half a century. So that the areas that were first exploited for oil are now absolutely converted into something else. So north of the Napo River in eastern Ecuador, you can't even see the forest from any road. If you travel along roads in that region, you basically see a coffee plantation, a palm plantation, things like bananas, corn, manioc, things like that along the roads, and an oil well, and there's some more of those crops, and then there's a big pasture, and then there's some more crops, and there's another oil well, gas flares. That's what the landscape looks like. So it's changed at the level of horizon to horizon, basically. And so what we're afraid of is that if oil companies continue to open up these roads to get access to the remote parts of Yasuni that are still left, then that same wave of conversion will eventually overtake the entirety of the park. When we talk about proportions, I think it's easy to say that at least half of the park is already impacted by oil extraction. And when I say impacted, I mean beyond just having a road out into the middle of nowhere to get access to oil. I mean, there has already been colonization of those roadways, and people have started to impact the landscape by huge expanses of deforestation. In the areas where new roads are built, it doesn't look so bad immediately, but within 5 or 10 or 20 years, you get essentially this cancerous loss of rainforest. And remember, we talked about having 100,000 species of organisms per hectare. And so as we change something from this exuberant forest that's 30 to 40 meters tall, so 100 to 120 or so feet tall, with habitat and structure that's compatible with things like monkeys and macaws, then we turn that into a pasture. Obviously, none of those organisms have a place to exist. And so despite the fact that the oil companies aren't going out and clear-cutting the entirety of Yasuni or any part of the world, they're opening the door so that other people do. And unless we have a very different kind of management of the situation, every time we open a road, we should expect to lose some breadth of the forest that's probably kilometers wide, as opposed to thinking, well, it's just a road. It's only 40 meters wide. It's we've contained this. The containment is a very transitory kind of phase, or at least that's what history has shown us in other places in the tropics where people are relatively poor, and when an opportunity presents itself, somebody tends to take that opportunity. Another part of that story is, I think everybody has heard this old adage that if we don't learn from history, we're destined to repeat it. But the other part of that we don't think about is that the one thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. So in that regard, we have this very predictable kind of path that we can follow unless we are extremely proactive about avoiding that. And I'd say so far we haven't been especially proactive, and we haven't been very protective of nature. We've gone through these very predictable stages of essentially saying we need more money, we have to extract more resources, and so let's move into that area, and it's just falling like dominoes. I would say as we've moved across the different oil concession areas in eastern Ecuador.
So how do you convince people about the importance of conservation when they can only see profit there?
That is the $1 million question, or it's actually the $1 trillion question, and it's extremely difficult because on one side of this equation we have a resource that we know very well. We know how to get it out. We know what it's worth per barrel. And so that side of the equation is somewhat easy, but it's not entirely easy either, because we know that there are big fluctuations in the value of oil, and we know that in the last year and a half, oil prices across the world have dropped drastically. And for Ecuador, we've gone from selling oil for nearly $100 a barrel down to selling oil for $40-something per barrel. Ecuador's oil, because it's in remote areas and it's not of great quality, is difficult to extract. And so what that means is that for this country, there has to be more money put into the process up front, and so the profit margin is essentially nothing at this point. It's the same kind of idea as the oil sands or the tar sands in Canada. Geologists knew about those things for probably 150 years, but even up until the 1980s, most geologists said, when oil reaches $100 a barrel, maybe it'll be worthwhile, in a very joking kind of way. But most people thought it'll never be worthwhile to even try to extract that, because it's going to be such an involved process. Well, Ecuador's oil isn't quite like that, but Ecuador's oil is pretty thick and gloppy, and it doesn't flow like the oil that comes out of the Middle East, for example. And it has lots of sulfur in it, and so sulfur means that it's somewhat acidic, and so it damages equipment, and so the investment and basically the return on your investment is quite limited. And so when we're extracting oil in this country and we can sell it for $100 a barrel, then the profit margin is probably $40, just free money basically, right? When the world market changes drastically and that price drops below $50 a barrel, then we're basically producing oil for pennies at best. And now, just this last week, something else changed as far as the oil productivity in the world, and that is that the U.S. has just come to an agreement with Iran to lift lots of those sanctions. And so now Iran is once again more free to export its oil right around the world, which means, now we have more oil available on the world market, and the value of that oil is automatically, based on supply and demand, going to drop a little bit. What does that mean for Ecuador's poor quality oil? That its value is going to go down even more. How much more? Hard to say. Is it worthwhile for Ecuador to continue to extract oil? Probably not. Probably not. But because we're so indebted to countries, especially China, we have no choice but to extract that oil and at least give it to them as, it's like, well, we got this stuff, you can take that, it's worth something. You're not going to make any money on it, but their economy is also, and their development is also hungry for oil. And so, whether it's money or fossil fuels, they'll take it, right? And so we have this flow where now we're taking out this product that's not producing money for Ecuador really, but it's paying off debt, kind of more in kind than as something that really helps the economy. When you ask about how do you balance the money side of this with the conservation side, well, so yeah, oil is worth something and we can put a real value on that, whereas what's forest worth? And then people say, well, there's this number of cubic meters of timber out there. And of course, they also mean, well, you got to cut it down to take advantage of that. But for conservationists, we really want to say, what's it worth while it's standing there and full of life and all those species of plants and those hundreds of thousands of species of animals. And usually we come to the conclusion, well, all that stuff is very attractive to an ecotourist. And so how much is a hectare of rainforest worth that has monkeys and tapirs and you know, basically the lions and tigers and bears kind of story, right? Well, it is worth something, but it's hard to put a real value on that. We know that some countries like Costa Rica have a tremendous piece of their economy that's based on ecotourism. Costa Rica makes at least $500 million a year on ecotourism. It's a very small country with only about 3 million citizens. And they've done a great job with marketing. Ecuador has just begun to market its potential as an ecotouristic destination. There's a tremendous potential, but what is that number? Could that number somehow be balanced against that number that is the value of oil? And now in southern Ecuador, there's this a tremendous deposit of copper and gold that's coming into the discussion. Yeah, so now we're talking about $200 billion worth of copper and gold that nobody is going to ignore. That's a lot of money. And so once again, you got the oil, you got the copper, you got the gold with real numbers, and then we have on this other side ecotourism. Well, it can be developed, and we can bring in more tourists. Galapagos brings in something like 200,000 tourists per year and millions of dollars. Hawaii has over 6 million visitors each year. Of course, a lot of them aren't ecotourists. I don't think we want 6 million visitors trying to pour through Yasuni or Galapagos either. I don't think the carrying capacity even approaches that. So
what about the value of the forest itself, not in economic terms?
Well, we talk about ecological services, right? The forest is producing oxygen, absorbing carbon dioxide, recycling water, and those kind of things. And some economists have looked at what it would cost to replace that kind of production and recycling, and they come up with numbers that nobody likes to believe because they're huge. And it's like, well, the rainforest is worth $10 million per year per hectare. Really? And then we say, well, but air is free, oxygen is free, and water is too. And so when we use those kinds of arguments, they're certainly valid, but they turn out to, for the average person on the street or a person who's trying to run a government, with real cash flow, they tend to be a little bit empty, right? They just don't have much applicability. They're completely legitimate, real arguments, but because we've lived on this planet for so long without even considering that those things might someday have to be paid for, we don't even want to hear those arguments. Another thing that we talk about a lot is for potential is medicinal plants. The fact that over half of all the clinically available medicines in the world have have their sources back there in some plant that was growing out there as a weed, maybe 100 years or 300 years ago. We need to be aware that there is this tremendous potential, especially because, once again, I'll go back to that idea that we haven't cataloged very well all this species diversity. If we talk to indigenous people, they'll say, oh, this is good for this, and you can use that for that, and you can use this to, and there's all kinds of things that if you walk around with an indigenous person that knows about medicinal plants for an hour, you're thinking, there's all these resources here and we're not taking advantage of them. And the truth is that we haven't studied, even using those hints from shamans from places like Amazonia, we haven't studied those things for clinical applicability, well, for more than maybe 3 or 5% in most places in Amazonia. And so if we're saying that a huge proportion of the drugs we use today for modern medicine came from plants originally, and we haven't even looked at 97% of the plants in a place like Yasuni, but local people use those plants for all kinds of treatments, then we're really missing an opportunity here. And there's this, but once again, there's this potential value, but it's not a realized value. And so when you say oil and copper and gold, on one side of the balance, you got ecotourism, and you have medicinal plants, and production of oxygen and absorption of carbon dioxide. They're extremely nebulous kinds of figures, and so most governments say, we'll take the real money, and well, yeah, you tree huggers can worry about that sometime in the future. And that's always this thing of, we're doing this now, and everything gets pushed back in time. This deferral of actually having to pay the cost for environmental impacts or environmental services is the problem, I think, as far as making arguments to the people who run the world, whether it's from a political position or from an economic position, and it is the challenge.
Interesting. I was watching an interview that you had done where you talked about, you said when natural disasters happen, everybody recognizes the fact that something big happened here and destroyed the land. But could you kind of explain that a little bit?
I think one of the things that we often need to gain in all these kinds of stories is perspective. And right now, I'm impressed with Donald Trump in the U.S. as a presidential candidate, and he has this perspective that's very much just money oriented, and I think my suggestion would be that he needs to gain some perspective about average people. He probably needs to gain some perspective about natural resources and the fact that all those natural resources have to come from somewhere, and that all the primary materials that we use for everything that we produce comes from nature. All that comes from nature, and so I think somebody like that have these glaring gaps in their perspective. But I think most of us have huge gaps in our perspective because of our backgrounds or what we've been exposed to. And one of the things that I'm always there's a few of these things associated with the environment that I'm always impressed by. One is that the fact that I work in contact with nature a lot. And some people say, well, it's more like a vacation than work, isn't it? I say, well, no, I'm not there doing things that, provide some product. It might be ideas in students' heads or something like that. But what I do is definitely some kind of work at some level. And people often ask me, because of that perspective, things like, when are you going to get a real job? Why don't you work in the real world right? And it just strikes me as being extremely strange and representing a tremendous lack of perspective, especially because the way I see it, I'm one of the few people in the world who has the opportunity to work in the real world. The real world is that one out there that is nature. This thing that most people call the real world is absolutely artificial, and it's made by humans. Well, to produce this thing that's artificial, we've gone through this process of converting nature into something else for our own uses. And usually it means either croplands or pasture lands or cities and roadways and those kind of things. And if you fly from Miami to New York and just look out the window, there's some tiny patches of forest left, but it's mostly cities and suburbs, and there's a little place there that's got some representation of what was there 500 years ago. And you're back into suburbs and cities, and it's kind of the whole landscape. Well, what I tend to say in this regard for perspective is that during the lifetime of a person, we don't see things change very much. I should probably answer that. We'll continue that same line there. Okay.
Do you remember where you
Okay,
were?
I have an idea where I was. So we have this idea that we're changing the world for ourselves, right? And what that means is that everything that was nature is being turned into something else that no longer can support tens of species, much less hundreds of thousands of species. And I think the really odd thing is that we call that progress, right? And of course, it represents something that we have done to change that landscape so that somehow we get all these advantages. Nothing else gets any advantage out of this, or hardly anything. There's a few species that are weedy kinds of things, whether they're plants or animals, that benefit from us eliminating all the big predators and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I can't say everything is harmed by our activities, but almost everything. And whenever we look out across a landscape, I think the vast majority of people tend to see things like shopping malls and high-rises as being, monuments to our great effort and representations of these fantastic advances of civilization, without considering that means something on the other side, that we have also lost something and replaced it with this, and so we don't have what we had before. That idea of having your cake and eating it too. And we talk about sustainability and this pie in the sky kind of idea of somehow building a building or a mall or something and not having those big impacts. It's just on the way to the university this morning. I was driving by and I noticed this sign. It's actually the name of this huge complex that's being built, and the first part of that, the whole name is Eco Park, and I'm thinking, it's not, it's an industrial park, yes, but the eco part doesn't fit at all. And maybe they're going to have some solar panels on the roof or something, and that's what makes it eco. I don't know, but certainly one of the things that we need to do as time goes along is to get some perspective about the part that we're commandeering and how much needs to be left. Because so far it's all been for us. It's like, I'll just take a little more. Take a little more, take a little more. And it doesn't show so much within a decade or within the lifetime of a person. And I've often said that if we looked out across a landscape like here, and we could, and this kind of thing happened in minutes, as opposed to over a period of decades or centuries, then everybody would see that and would recognize it for what it is. This tremendous destruction and this tremendous replacement. We have lost something here while we're gaining something. And we need to recognize that there is this loss as well as this gain for us. And the question is, how much can we continue to lose on that side of the equation before it affects us in a very drastic way? Many scientists have been saying for about the last half century that we're racing really hard toward some breaking point, some tipping point. And the question is, how do we know until we've passed it? And what that means is that it looks like human nature is to continue that until we are slapped in the face by this, as opposed to saying, I can see this coming, maybe we should do something about it. I've also likened this to the idea of having being in a plane, flying along in a plane, and having a pilot that doesn't pay attention to where you're going. It's like eating a sandwich and reading a magazine, And I realize that you can have a plane on automatic pilot, and you can fly really high and not worry about that. But let's think about doing that in a small plane and at a low elevation, right? And you're not really paying attention. There's a mountain coming up. And I want a pilot that's actually looking out ahead, maybe with some great visibility, as opposed to going, oh, there's a mountain, and pulling us out of that. And then a few minutes later, noticing that, wow, those trees are really tall, or those kind of things. I think we need definitely more vision so that we can gain some of this perspective about what we can legitimately or sustainably take from nature, and what absolutely has to be left out there to continue the functioning of Gaia, the system planet, so that we can continue on. I also think that, right when I was born, there were fewer than 3 billion people on the planet. And I know I'm old. But now there's over 7. And some people are saying that by the middle of the century, there'll be over 9. And that by the end of the century, we may be out there at 11 billion people. I already see that we're having trouble with the distribution of resources, and we're already having problems with global climate change, and the way we use fossil fuels is just absolutely untenable. How do we pass along those messages while on the other side, we have economists who are saying we have to grow it, we have to keep it growing, or things will collapse. And just last year, there was a big summit meeting, I think, of the G20, that said that by the middle of the century, we should double the infrastructure on the planet. And of course, most environmentalists would say, we need to just draw a line in the sand and say, we're not going to go past that. And those two arguments are so far apart that I don't know how I don't know how we have any potential of sorting this out. I think we're kind of headed toward the end point of that animated movie, WALL-E, right? You get to a place where, there's nothing left here, and so and people have this absurd idea that, we can colonize other planets. Good luck. So far, we've managed to get, I don't know, a couple dozen people onto the nearest rock out there in space in all of history, and that's, I don't know how we're going to save humanity, especially when we're talking about billions of people as opposed to dozens. So I think in the end, we need some real perspective. How can we get that perspective? Maybe by listening to some old people. Because if you've only lived for 20 years, or if you've only lived for 50 years, then gaining some real perspective, I think, is extremely difficult.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that was super interesting.
More depressing than interesting?
Yeah, pretty sad. Whoa, those were all the
Yeah.
questions I was going to ask,
Does that-
unless you wanted to add anything.
cover most of the kinds of things that you had in mind? or-
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Thank you for so much time.
Got an hour of recording, so.
Thanks.
Yeah, so you can throw away 58 minutes of that and you'll be good.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thanks for trying to make a difference in the world.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
So go out there and fix it.
We'll do our best.